In his 1913 article, Static Mechanics and Irreversibility, French mathematician Émile Borel was perhaps the first person to propose the infinite monkey theorem. The idea that an infinite amount of monkeys hitting random keys on a typewriter for an infinite amount of time would eventually type any given text, the most common example being the complete works of William Shakespeare. Equally true, though with far less use to mathematicians, is that if you gave two different people the exact same synopsis of the exact same basic story from which they had to write a novel, you would get two different tales. This seems obvious when you give it a moment's thought. Our two theoretical writers are different people. Even with the exact same amount of technical skill, if it were possible to accurately quantify such a thing, they will have different lived experience and outlook. And no matter the story, this will shape what they create. This, incidentally, is the core of why AI-generated works are soulless, why they cannot be classed as art. Art is an act of creation, into which the creator pours themselves, that self being not just the sum of a person's knowledge and influences, but also the journey by which they learn what they know, and the personal lens through which they view the art from which they take influence. A data training model cannot be creative for the same reason that we cannot get to know someone simply by reading a summary of their life on Wikipedia. All of which is to say that all art, is a reflection of the person that created it, as they were at the time of its creation. That reflection varies in strength, of course. Technical skill, authorial intent, time taken, and more are all variables which affect this outcome. Then there are external pressures, deadlines, removal of or limitation on the autonomy of the artist, critical reception, commercial pressures, fan expectations, all of which pull us away from the ideal of pure art, if such a thing can be said to exist. This contradiction is one that Dakota, the protagonist of indie horror game Project Songbird, and the game's creator Connor Rush both struggle with. As we start the game, we meet Connor first. This is unusual, since although most modern games present you with options at the start to calibrate your experience, they don't typically take the form of the game's creator introducing himself as though personally settling you into the journey. However, this moment has no context beyond a quirky design choice until we get into the game's third act. So we'll start off with Dakota.
Take 27.
A singer-songwriter under the stage name Neon Songbird, they've been struggling with writer's block in the wake of negative fan and critical reception to their experiments with new sounds, and facing pressure from their label to produce something safer and more marketable for their new album. As we go through the game, this is ultimately the core conflict that defines everything and catalyzes events. The tug of war between art as a form of self-expression and an outlet for passion, and entertainment as a commercial product beholden to the eternal capitalist demand of line must go up. And even when it's not about sales and profits, there's the weight of fan expectations, and the fact that, regardless of individual fans' tastes, the collective fandom is so heavily beholden to the marketing and commercialization that, even if they theoretically dislike the unoriginal or the formulaic, they will nonetheless react against and punish attempts at anything new. This contradiction is evident enough in the music industry, from bands decried as sellouts if they get their bag for their work, to the cries of betrayal from fans if their sound changes, whether through natural evolution, new inspiration, or simply a desire to try something different. And what makes it all harder is that there are sometimes legitimate criticisms to be made in these forms. Labels forcing sanitization and homogenization to curate mass market appeal, bands themselves abandoning their identity to chase trends, etc., which sit alongside a more visceral, reactionary opposition to any change for any reason, real or perceived, making the whole thing a minefield to navigate. These contradictions and pressures also exist in other entertainment spheres, with the situation in gaming of particular relevance here. The AAA space is becoming increasingly homogenized as budgets balloon, and anything not viewed as safe for a return on investment is jettisoned, while the apparent freedom of the indie scene has its own battles with the need for funding, potentially securing publishers and fan expectations, whether we mean fans of the developer, the genre, or the very concept of indie games. All of this comes into play within the meta-narrative of the game, which we'll discuss in more depth when we get to Connor's role in the world he's created. Returning to Dakota and their artistic troubles, the solution posed by their agent is the long-standing answer for troubled artists of all kinds: getting away from the noise of modernity to create in self-imposed seclusion, in the form of a cabin in the Appalachian wilderness. Writers and artists' retreats, both individual and collective, are a real and useful way to get the creative juices flowing. Real life can provide its own inspirations, but also distractions and diversions. And from my own experience of residential trips while studying creative writing at university, now 20 years ago, my God, they are fantastic at removing all excuses to do anything other than create. But the cabin in the woods is also an iconic setting for horror shenanigans, from Evil Dead to, well, Cabin in the Woods. And if we tie in the specific theme of artists struggling to revive their art, but instead being drawn into supernatural horrors, we have the likes of The Shining and Alan Wake. Like Jack Torrance, Dakota finds themselves visited by entities that may be ghosts or something more primeval, which shows them things beyond the veil of what passes for normal or real. But while these things drove Jack to a madness that results in terror for his family, rendering him the villain or the monster, what Dakota sees both sparks their creativity and forces them into the echoes of a past they don't want to revisit. This puts them closer to Alan Wake, whose writing feeds the dark presence and allows it to grow stronger and expand its influence into reality. But here, the only reality that's reshaped is Dakota's own. And while the dark presence takes Wake's wife Alice in order to get him to write in the hope of bringing her back, Dakota's loss occurs before we meet them, and the songs they produce are the result of facing that loss in their own psyche, as reflected by the woods. Just as Dakota is a songwriter, their brother Finn was a painter, and at the start of the game in Dakota's apartment, one of the first things we can interact with is his last painting, a discomforting impressionist piece of a person with a significant chunk of themselves missing. Much like Dakota, Finn struggled with the weight of expectations and self-doubt around his art, and it's confirmed as we progress that the red door which haunts Dakota's nightmares is the door to Finn's studio, where they found him after he had hanged himself. Their guilt over this memory, and the belief that they could have prevented it by arriving earlier, is compounded by it inspiring the songs that prove too much of a deviation from the usual sound for critics, fans, and the label, creating a complex tapestry of emotions that only make it harder to break out of the funk that they find themselves in. When we arrive at the retreat, as the player, our first tasks are to settle in with the mundane and the routine, chopping wood for a fire, fixing a broken water filter, exploring our surroundings and learning what more we can see if we find the tools to access additional areas. There are hints of the horrors to come, but even they feel low level, low risk. The thumping in the night that turns out to be a wheelie bin getting knocked over, the sinister shape that disappears when we turn on the light. But then we find Finn's painting in an otherwise peaceful grove, and a noise brings us running back to the cabin, where we find a discarded bird skull. Finally, once more awakening in the dead of night, we're led by orbs of light and echoing whispers to a red door that leads us into a world of dream and distorted memory. In folklore, will-o'-the-wisps are the kind of elemental spirit that can reveal hidden paths or lead people astray, both physically and metaphorically. In Appalachia specifically, the Brown Mountain Lights caused enough concern that locals demanded a government investigation. But although US Geological Survey scientist George Mansfield demonstrated that they were trains, car headlights and bushfires, theories persisted that the lights were anything from ghosts to UFOs. Dakota's lights are more supernatural than extraterrestrial, leading her to an otherworld wherein she must confront her own memories. Across the course of the game, there are 3 visits to the otherworld, punctuated by the exploration of the wilderness in the daytime, the mundanity of it becoming less serene and more pregnant with waiting terror each time we return from where the lights have led us. The 2 overlap, and items from the other world allow us to explore further in the real world, in turn facilitating the next visitation. But while in time we can remove barriers and push a bit further, the world around the cabin doesn't fundamentally change. Each visit to the other world, however, takes us both deeper into Dakota's past and their psyche, as they get closer to confronting their trauma, and at the same time deeper into the history and folklore of the region. Appalachia's collective memory is one of cryptids, granny magic and violent labour struggles, which all coalesce here in Dakota's journey through their own trauma in pursuit of their authentic artistic voice. That journey begins in a maze of generic, sterile offices, cubicles, and various other elements of 9-to-5 corporate life, which Dakota escaped from to pursue music. And the levels here are steeped in symbolism. The mannequins, a mass of inert, faceless people who not only serve as intensely creepy set decoration, but also demonstrate that the bland, featureless walls aren't the only things blocking you into this lifestyle. The maddening, repeating hallways where the only escape from the endless repetition is to notice enough difference to solve the puzzle of a mannequin demanding to be made whole. Perhaps a stand-in for Dakota, losing pieces of themselves by staying trapped in this environment. And the crows, who have their own broader symbolism that we'll come to. Songbirds trapped in a repeating pattern tied to the clocks. Whether an office or a factory, that unending repetition is one that a majority will never escape. The burden of the working class, which of course Appalachia is more than familiar with in its long history of labour struggles, as we've mentioned and will return to. But despite apparent escape, Dakota finds themselves bound by the same trap as an artist. The mannequins no longer the colleagues boxing them into corporate life, but the crowd, the weight of whose expectations presents a different kind of box. Perhaps the most terrifying set piece of the game is when we encounter what looks like a statue. Stock still as long as we observe it, its limbs sharp and its face a horrifying cubist distortion. But we cannot look at it forever, and as we turn our back, we hear a frantic shortness of breath that gets more intense and closer in time with a rising, dissonant violin cue. Turning, we find the thing too close for comfort. And if we don't turn in time, death. Unlike the other enemies in the game, this isn't some cryptid that could have come straight from folklore. It's a work of art, shaped into an instrument of violence if we fail to give it due attention. And in the majority of instances, the thing warring for our attention is a puzzle where we need to press specific piano keys. Once we learn that, after their last conversation with Finn on the phone, Dakota opted to finish composing their latest song before driving out to meet him. Too late. The macabre meaning of this setup becomes all too apparent. And the next time we encounter an endless, repeating corridor, the only way we can get out of it is by turning and going backwards, going against the flow. While, if we want to move forwards and make actual progress, then we must place a stuffed crow on the perch. This is a defining image of the game, the crow present as a motif not only through the game but also in its key art. Because the crow is a songbird, but it is a songbird without a song, only a grating core. But that, in the end, is the point. The crow does have a song, but the song is only for the crow itself. While going through the horrors in the wilderness, Dakota learns about Granny Witch, a local legend who provides aid and can cure ailments, but is also said to cause them. The folklore of Appalachian granny magic is a fusion of Cherokee and Choctaw knowledge of flowers, berries, and roots, entwined with Western European and African rituals and natural remedies. These practices were heavily matriarchal, and of course looked on with suspicion by patriarchal and church institutions. That suspicion reflected in the fearful account Dakota discovers. But although Dakota's journey is fraught with danger in the form of both cryptid and living art enemies, the Granny Witch is never presented as orchestrating these threats. And if you die, it's her voice that brings you back to press on.
You ain't leaving yet. I can still fix you.
She gives Dakota both the inspiration for new songs and, by making them confront their trauma, the impetus to leave the record label behind once their obligations are fulfilled, allowing them to make the songs they want to make and pursue music for its own sake. Exactly what Finn was never able to do, and which leads to him taking his own life. But this is not the whole story, as we also have Connor Rush's meta-narrative. He doesn't insert himself into Dakota's story directly, instead pulling us back from it to show us a snapshot of his time developing the game. Like Dakota, he grapples with the weight of critical fan and industry expectation, and finds it hard to take the advice of those around him who tell him to create for himself rather than obsessing over reviews. Connor's fears and uncertainty are feelings that will be familiar to anyone who has created something personal and made themselves vulnerable by putting it out into the world. They echo Dakota's, as you would expect, but also amplify them, because the self-insert is something he could have gotten away with not doing. On its own, Dakota's story is powerfully and emotionally compelling. Their personal exploration of grief, imposter syndrome, and what it means to create art, dovetailing with the exploration of Appalachian folklore and history to create a haunting examination of the psychic weight of our pasts, both individual and collective. By adding into that the very story of the game we're currently playing, Connor builds a whole additional layer to tie everything together. This meta-narrative is most noticeable when we watch footage of Connor as he works in the game and interacts with friends and family. But his personal interjection into our game settings, and later his request for mid-game feedback, also form a part of it. We're playing his game, but we're playing it under his supervision as he wrestles with his own doubts. It's also worth observing here that there are two meta-narratives at play. The one we can see most obviously being the metafiction of Connor struggling with artistic integrity as he makes the game we're in the midst of playing. But the history and culture of Appalachia is also a meta-narrative, in the historical rather than fictional sense of the word, that grounds and frames the story. The Granny Witch is the product of a unique cultural fusion over centuries, and through the process of the settler colonial development of the USA. The mountains and the mines are part of the region's unique geography and the class struggles it bore witness to. In the game, we learn that the miners' supervisor tried to lock them in with the cryptids, a relatively minor act of violence next to the region's infamous coal wars, including the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921, where 10,000 armed miners took on the mine guard system, wherein the coal companies ruled the coal fields as a police state in which the workers had no rights. But the in-game injustice weaves these two aspects of the region's history and culture together in a way that helps make the historical meta-narrative to frame the fictional meta-narrative about what it means to make art and the pressures and contradictions we face in doing so. The end result of which is an extremely powerful and personal game with an exceptionally strong emotional core. One that is eternally relevant in dissecting how we not only create, but also consume and react to art, and is especially prescient in relation to the games industry, caught as it is between the unyielding demands of capitalism and the cycles of discourse where the loudest voices tend to be the least thoughtful. But there is hope, still, in the very fact that deeply personal and introspective games like Project Songbird still emerge, and provide an experience that is both fun to play and tells a story that captures you until long after you've put down the controller. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like. I put out new videos talking about horror stories and video games at least once a month, so consider subscribing to keep up to date and make sure you don't miss out. You can get early access to future videos on both this and my other channel by joining my Patreon for as little as £1 a month. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.